Hello, my name is John Ford, and welcome to my Proxmox Automated Environment Provisioning course series. If you've been following along so far, we've gone ahead, we've prepared Proxmox, and we've also set up pfSense as a virtual machine within Proxmox to be used as our firewall. We've also gone ahead and set up a management machine that we can use to configure pfSense. In this video, I am going to talk about how to actually set up the Proxmox and pfSense remote management scripts that I created that will be used by your students to then create, destroy, or access one copy of the environment that you set up for them. These scripts, as I will discuss later in the video, can either be set up on the same management machine that you're using to manage pfSense, or they can be set up externally on a separate web server. That's kind of up to you. As long as you use a mainstream Linux distribution like Debian or Ubuntu or CentOS or Fedora, you should be fine to follow along with the steps in this video, where we're going to go ahead and set up the environment. These next steps should be performed on your web server. In other words, the machine on which you want to install the Proxmox and pfSense remote management scripts, and additionally the machine on which you want to install the web interface that students will, or users, will then access to create their environments. In my case, I decided to put this directly on the manager machine, or the machine that I'm using to manage pfSense, just to keep everything within Proxmox. However, if you were doing this on an external server, you would simply follow these same steps. These steps are outlined in the README of the GitHub repository for the scripts and web interface. I will include a link to this in the description of this video. From here, looking at the main page, I can visit the web guide by clicking here on this web guide link, or simply by navigating to web.md. I will be following these setup instructions here. Feel free to use this checklist as a guide. The first thing I'm going to do is open up a terminal. I will maximize this terminal for better viewing. I like to install additional services in the opt folder, so I will navigate to the /opt folder with change directory cd /opt. Now that I'm in the opt directory, I can clone the GitHub repository. To do this, I will use git. If git is not installed, you can install git with sudo apt install git, and specifying your sudo password, which in my case is capital P password 123 exclamation point. Once git is installed, I can clone this repository with git clone and the URL of the repository, which is at github.com/redefiningreality/proxmox-remote-management.git. This next step is optional, but I would like to name the directory something other than Proxmox Remote Management. I will call it P2RM. P2 because it's Proxmox and pfSense, so P2, and RM for remote management. This will clone this GitHub repository to the P2RM folder within the opt folder. You'll notice that I got a permission denied warning because the opt folder is not directly accessible by the manager user. Therefore, I will prepend this command with sudo to run this as the root user. Once completed, I can see that it has created this new p2rm directory, and I can enter that directory with cd p2rm. Listing the contents of this directory, I see two interesting scripts, setup.py and configure.py. Setup.py will be used to set up the Proxmox and pfSense remote management scripts. In addition, it will install the dependencies required in order to host our web interface. From there, configure.py will fully configure our web interface. Please note that in order to run these scripts, you must have at least Python version 3.9 installed on your operating system. This comes installed by default in most Linux distributions. To see my current Python version, I can simply run python --version. If the command python is not found, I can try again with python 3 --version. You'll notice I do in fact have Python installed, and it is Python version 3.11.2, which is sufficient for running these setup scripts. To install the Proxmox and pfSense remote management scripts, I'll simply run sudo /setup.py. If this does not work for you, you can always try running it directly from Python with python 3 setup.py. Now is where everything from the previous videos in the series will start to come together. First of all, we do want to install dependencies using the pip package manager. We can use Y or N to specify yes or no. However, the default is yes, so I can simply press enter. Unfortunately, no module named pip was located. This is probably because we don't have the pip package manager installed. Therefore, I'm going to hold down Control and press C to kill this setup and stop the installation. From here, I'm going to install the Python pip package manager. I will do this by entering sudo apt install python3-pip. Once this installation has completed, I will once again try to run the setup script. And once again, I will say yes to installing script dependencies. Now that all of the script dependencies have installed successfully, it asks me to provide the host name of the Proxmox instance. In my case, it is the same IP address that I'm using to access my Proxmox instance, which is 216.47.144.123. The port number for the Proxmox instance by default is 8006. You can simply press enter if you did not change this. However, if you port forwarded to port 443 like I did, here you can specify port 443. Now it's going to go ahead and check the connection to Proxmox. As you can see, it says the connection was successful. From here, we will enter the Proxmox username for authentication. This is the username you specified when you were creating your Proxmox API token. In my case, it was in fact root@pam, so I will just type in root@pam. Now you have to enter the name of the Proxmox authentication token. This is also known as the token ID. If you remember, I specified the name of root, and so I can just leave this at its default and press enter. Now you have to enter the value of your Proxmox authentication token. As I mentioned earlier in this series, you should have kept note of this value. If you forgot the value or did not keep note of it, you'll have to create a new API token. To make this simple, I have already copied the value of my Proxmox API token to the clipboard, so I can simply paste it with right-click, paste. It looks like authentication of Proxmox was successful, and now we can choose from the available nodes. In my case, the node I'm working with, or in other words, the server I'm working with, is ECE2224. So I will enter ECE2224. Now it asks us if we would like to configure a pfSense firewall, to which we will say yes, or simply press enter. Now I will enter the host name of the pfSense firewall. Keep in mind that we should use the IP address from which this web server will be accessing the firewall. If you are accessing your firewall externally, you can use the firewall's WAN IP address. However, since we are accessing it internally, we will use the firewall's LAN IP address. If you forgot what these IP addresses are, you can simply go back to your pfSense firewall in the console, and at the top, you will see listed your WAN and LAN IP addresses. Again, because this manager machine is connected to the LAN of pfSense, I will use its internal LAN IP address of 192.168.1.1. Here you will enter the port number on which you would like to SSH into the pfSense firewall. If you didn't change it from its default, it will simply be 22, and you can press enter. Now, we can enter the name of our pfSense firewall SSH user, which by default is root. If you didn't create an additional user, you can simply leave it at its default and press enter. Now we will enter the root password for the pfSense firewall. Remember, we set the root password for the pfSense firewall when we were configuring it through its terminal. The password I set was capital P password 123 exclamation point. From here, enter the path to the configuration file in pfSense. You probably did not change this, but this option is here in case you did. By default, it's in /cf/conf/config.xml. We can simply accept the default and press enter. Now all of the changes based on the information we entered have been made to each of the scripts. From here it asks if we would like to add the links to these scripts to our path so they can be executed as commands. I do in fact want to do this, and so I will press enter for yes. Now it asks if we would like to set up Apache 2 and PHP. I will simply press enter for yes. This will go ahead and grab the required packages to set up our web server. Once this is completed, we have finished our setup, and as specified by the instructions, we may now run configure.py to configure the Apache 2 web server accordingly. All right, from here I'll again run sudo./configure.py and press enter. From here, it asks us to enter the domain name or IP address used to visit the website. If you set up a domain name, you may enter it here. But in our case, we will simply use the IP address. Remember that this website will be visited through the pfSense firewall, and the pfSense firewall will forward any web requests to this manager machine that is hosting the website. Therefore, we need to use the pfSense firewall's WAN IP address in this case. This may be different if you decided to create an external web server. In my case, the IP address is 216.47.144.118. As it states, it is highly recommended that you create a custom TLS certificate for serving your website securely. Otherwise, when users visit your website, they will be greeted with a message that tells them that you are using not a self-signed TLS certificate. However, in my case, I do not care to create a custom TLS certificate. If I did, for example, using a site like Let's Encrypt, I would simply specify the path of the .crt file here. However, to use a self-signed certificate, I will leave this blank. The same thing applies to the .key file for the TLS certificate, which I will leave blank. After entering this, it will go ahead and configure Apache 2 accordingly. Now that Apache 2 has been configured, it asks where I would like to save the web configuration file, config.ini. This web configuration file will be later used to specify all the configuration options for the web interface. This includes how you plan to manage users and the configuration options for cloning the network environment. In my case, I like to keep all my configuration files in the etc directory, which is pretty standard for Linux. Therefore, I am going to create a p2rm directory within etc that's going to host this config.ini file. In order to do this, I will specify the absolute or full path of /etc/p2rm. This means that the config.ini file will be saved in /etc/p2rm/config.ini, and I'll be able to access it there. Once this is done, the site has been fully set up, and as the message here states, we can further configure site preferences in that configuration file, which is located in etc p2rm config.ini. Once we create all the required changes, we can then restart our web server with systemctl start Apache 2.